Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the International Basketball Performance Community. Firstly, a very big thank you to all the healthcare workers for obviously risking their lives daily so we can stay home and be safe. Thomas and I created this platform to connect with performance professionals all over the world and serve as an affordable educational resource for this community. And today we're really excited to deliver our second webinar on sleep and recovery. We'll have Meeta present on managing sleep and fatigue during a road trip in the NBA or professional basketball. And Stephen will present on creating a recovery framework in the NBA and professional basketball. Obviously, there's some differences in NBA and other professional basketball leagues, but he'll give a nice overview on that. And then we'll save the last 10 minutes for a question and answer portion for all of you watching. So having said that, during this webinar, feel free to just leave questions. The Q&A tab at the bottom of this screen. Feel free throughout this whole call, just any questions you may have that pop up, feel free to type them in. And then at the end of our webinar today, Thomas will get to them and we'll answer a few questions. So why don't we just do a quick introduction of everyone on this webinar. We can start with just your name, where you're from and where you currently are in the world, what your current position is, and then one thing that you're currently dedicating a bit more time to, since we probably have a little more free time as we're staying indoors more. So Meeta, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Meeta Singh. I'm a sleep medicine doctor. And so I'm a doctor of medicine. I did my training at Mayo Clinic and then at the Henry Ford Hospital. And I'm part of a multidisciplinary clinic at the Henry Ford Sleep Disorder Center, in which I see patients who have any sort of sleep problem, all ages. And then, of course, in addition to that, I have a niche practice in which I advise teams, individual athletes, on how to optimize sleep with the goal of optimizing performance. And, one of the things I've been doing is, now that we have more time on our hands, is trying to do more academic work. So maybe write papers, write chapters, and not to procrastinate as much.
Thanks, Meeta. Go ahead, Stephen.
Welcome everyone to the webinar, and thanks to Sam and Thomas for putting it on, and obviously Meeta for joining us as well. So my background is a little bit alternate. I left school fairly young, worked in the fitness and sports industry at a very young age. Then some 13 years later, then went to university. Was fortunate enough at that stage to gain some scholarships to do honours and a PhD, and that sort of opened the door for opportunities in elite sport. Predominantly from specifically a basketball perspective. I've worked with 3 national teams in Australia, but had fortunate enough to work with a couple of international teams, attended 2 Olympic Games, 5 World Championships, a couple of World Cups, which has been great. As far as working in the profession, generally speaking, when I start with a new organisation, it's about framework modelling. So looking at reviewing what they're currently doing with professional practice within their organisation, stripping that back, reverse engineering, and then looking at solving problems. I guess for now, I don't know that we've actually got more time in our hands, Sam. I think we're just redirecting some of Thomas and I actually are looking at doing some work with Basketball in New Zealand, helping with some of their frameworks, along with obviously writing a few papers along the way with our PhD and honours students. So a little bit of research, a little bit of practice, trying to keep everyone, in check, so to speak. So everything, when this gets lifted, we can get back to what we all enjoy doing.
Great.
Guess I go. I'm Thomas. I'll make it quick. It's my second year that I just completed as the Director of Performance for Huyghe Austin, in the country that I grew up in, here in Belgium. The previous 6 years, I was working in the United States with the NBA, NBA G League, and an NCAA team, which was fantastic experiences for me, just because of the broad variety of athletes and staff that I've worked with. And now, as Steve mentioned, I'm fully I'm super excited to work on that end together and collaborate on New Zealand basketball initiatives. And yeah, we've recently started with the IBPC together with Sam, this great webinar session. So we're super excited about the whole movement, but Sam will give a little bit more information on that.
Great. Yeah, I'm Sam Reffsin, and I am originally from Massachusetts in the States. I've spent most of my time in the NCAA as a performance coach, from NAIA to Division III to small Division I to bigger Division I. And then I spent about 1.5 years in Turkey working with the women's national team for a short stint, maybe about 4 or 5 months. And then I spent the rest of the time working with Thomas to just engage in the European basketball community. We gave several seminars and just met different performance professionals. And that was a really eye-opening experience for me because I've always been very interested in the performance landscape in Europe, but didn't really know much about it. So definitely connected and engaged a lot with that community. And that was a really eye-opening experience just from a diversity of thought. And now Thomas are continuing to just provide some educational content to anyone who's interested. And we want this to be a really affordable platform for everyone out there and try and connect the world into a really integrated approach with performance. Yeah, and then right now I'm just kind of working a little bit more on just connecting with smaller groups throughout the world. I do a weekly call with a really small group in England and staying in touch with all of you guys. So yeah, really excited to have everyone on board, and thank you all for watching because I know there's a lot of webinars out there. So I know you're getting a lot of overload with content right now. So we really appreciate you tuning in. Yeah, having said that, why don't we go ahead and get started? And Meeta, do you want to take it away?
Yes. So let me just see how I can share my screen. Okay. So you'll keep me on time?
I gotcha. Don't worry.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of short haul and long haul travel on sleep and performance in elite athletes. And to that end, I'm going to spend about 15-20 minutes, maybe more towards 15 minutes. And during the next 15 minutes, I just want to touch on the science of sleep and circadian systems. And I think this is really simple to understand, and it allows people, your audience, to form a foundation that they can use later when they want to, make do interventions or make plans for their own teams. I'm going to talk a little bit about jet lag and athletes and the interventions there, and then talk about a couple of different travel scenarios pertaining to the NBA before conclusions. Okay. So beginning with the science part. So sleep, sleepiness and wakefulness varies in a 24-hour period. And typically it's modulated by two separate things. The first, of course, is your sleep load. So if you wake up, say at about 8 o'clock in the morning, by the time, midnight or 1 o'clock rolls around, you have 16 or 17 hours of wakefulness that you have accumulated. When you are asleep, you consume that. So that's your sleep drive. That's what helps you fall asleep, especially in the first few hours of your sleep time. But in addition to that, we also have a clock in our brain. It's called our circadian clock. And when you wake up in the morning, that clock starts to secrete an alerting signal, which opposes this sleep drive, and it keeps you awake during the day. Now, in the mid-afternoon, there's a slight dip in your alertness, which is why after lunch, you might feel a little sleepy or tired. And it actually has nothing to do with the food you're eating and everything to do with the fact that there's actually a natural dip in your alertness. And then that alerting signal keeps increasing. And then at night, in the presence of darkness, the hormone melatonin is secreted, which helps maintain your sleep. So at night, your sleep is made, is modulated by either the hours of wakefulness you've had prior, or by your circadian clock, which helps maintain sleep. Okay, so now, the number of hours of wakefulness is important, because we know that if athletes get less sleep on a regular basis, it actually affects every aspect of your athletic performance, right? So at the most basic level, I like to think, when I'm talking to athletes, the two main ways that your performance is going to be impaired is that if you get less sleep, then your reaction time gets longer, and you want a quick, fast reaction time, and you become less accurate. But it's not just the sleep you get the night before the game, but it's the amount of sleep you get on a regular basis. And this is shown by this study. It's a complex looking slide, but easy to follow. And basically, this is a study in which they're looking at mean speed depending on the number of hours of sleep you've had. So if you get 3 hours of sleep versus 5 hours versus 7 versus 9 hours in bed, your mean speed is reduced. So your reaction time is increased. But if you get less sleep for 7 days, so these are people getting 3 hours in bed versus 5 versus 7 versus 9 hours in bed, as you can see the sleep, the mean speed keeps getting worse. So the deficits accumulate, right? So in the end, in this condition, everybody is getting 9 hours in bed for 3 nights. It's called recovery sleep, and there is recovery in performance, but it's never as good as somebody who's getting 9 hours in bed. Similarly, this is the number of times people are missing cues in the environment. So when you miss, when you're sleep deprived, you miss cues in the environment. If you're getting 3 hours versus 5 versus 7 versus 9, it's always worse the less sleep you get. And then there is recovery, there's some recovery, but never as good as somebody who's getting 9 hours in bed. So, another way to think about it for me is that this is somebody who's getting 7 hours in bed on a regular basis, still not as good as somebody who's getting 9 hours in bed, right? And for peak performance, especially in the NBA, success is really measured in milliseconds, right? And so I think of this as errors of omission, in which you don't react as fast, or you don't really see a ball coming towards you. So that's number one. The second reason you need enough sleep, of course, is because you need sleep to play the intelligent game. And of course, sleep affects the way you process emotion, the way you process memory. It affects a lot of things, but one of the most relevant things is that, when you wake up and you haven't had enough sleep and you feel that your head is kind of groggy, there's actually one part of the brain, which is the front part of your brain, that actually preferentially gets less blood supply when you're sleep deprived. And that's the front part of your brain is responsible for decision making. It's responsible for good judgment. It's responsible for moment-to-moment decisions, or multitasking. And at the same time, there's one part of the brain that actually lights up when you don't get enough sleep, which is your emotional brain. So when you're sleep deprived, when you get less sleep, you're likely to make decisions in which your brain is overly emotional while it's not making good decisions. And that is, again, very relevant to sports, because this function is preferentially impaired in time crunch situations. So think in the NBA, is it shot clock, in which you have a certain amount of time and you have to make these, that's where impairment can occur. So think of these as errors of commission, right? You're throwing the ball, but you're throwing it at the wrong person. And in fact, there's a study, because, one of the things that helps when you're sleep deprived is drinking coffee, because caffeine in any form improves your reaction time, but it does not improve your judgment. So when you're caffeinated, you're just making decisions faster, but they're still the wrong decisions. They're still, because your judgment is still impaired. Okay, but let's talk about that circadian clock, because that's important when it comes to travel. So because we live on this rotating rock, all of us, all organisms from single cell to human beings, we've developed cellular clocks. We have these intrinsic clocks in us which keep time in over a 24-hour period. And so for human beings, the clock is located on our brains. So I know there's a lot of science on this, pay attention. I'm going to have a quiz at the end on the things on this slide. But really, so the clock is intrinsic, it's in our brain, but every day it's reset by exposure to light and dark. And it's very simple. So when you wake up, light enters your eye, it hits your circadian clock, and your circadian clock secretes an alerting signal. In darkness, melatonin is secreted, and that dampens that alerting signal. Now, in addition to that circadian clock that you have in your brain, in fact, every cell in your body and every function in your body peaks and ebbs, so has a 24-hour rhythm. And that is important, especially for athletes. So again, don't pay attention. This is a complicated slide. This is midnight, 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 p.m. The only thing that you need to pay attention to is that things like your best coordination, your fastest reaction time, greatest cardiovascular efficiency, and muscular strength, they all tend to peak between 4 and 7 in the evening. So for somebody who's sleeping from 11 and wakes up at 7, there's actually a time during the day when all the functions that are responsible for athletic performance tend to peak. And they tend to peak at the same time when your body temperature tends to peak. So our body temperature has a circadian clock. It tends to peak in the late afternoon or the early evening. It's the same time when your joint stiffness is also at its minimum. Now, why is that important? So there are a few studies that look at the relevance of this fact that all of us have actually a time when our athletic function tends to peak. So this is 40 years of NFL data. And in this data, they looked at evening games. So these are evening games where the West Coast is versing the East Coast. And they found that the West Coast teams, because they're playing at their peak biological advantage time, beat the Las Vegas point spread and win twice as often. And there, of course, there's no such difference in when you look at daytime games. So clearly pointing out that this circadian advantage is above what we normally think of being important for athletic performance. Right? And I want you to know that this has also been shown in Major League Baseball. So because in USA there are, if you are going from one coast to the other, you're actually trapped crossing 3 time zones. So one of the things that happens is that in Major League Baseball, when East Coast teams are playing on the West Coast team and they get used to the West Coast time, when they come back to their home, they lose home field advantage that first night, the first time they play at home, because they're now jet lagged and they're out of sync at home, especially if their opposing team is coming from the same time zone. They've shown this in the NBA, in which West Coast teams biologically they're at an advantage, especially in evening games, and they tend to win more when they're versing the East Coast teams. Okay. So the other thing that your circadian clock also decides is what your chronotype is. So whether you're biologically wired to be a night owl or a morning person. And that's really important, because night owls will, remember what I was talking about peak biological, peak advantage, just time, that would be later during the day for a night owl. It would be earlier during the day for somebody who's a morning person. For example, again, I'm giving example from Major League Baseball, but in MLB, pitchers who are morning people pitch better during day games because they're playing at a time when they're peaking, or which is closer to their time. While night owls, tend to peak later in the evening. They peak better in night games. So, and this is important because we're talking about team sport, and a team is only as good as individual players. And ideally you want an entire team to have similar chronotypes, and you want the chronotype, you want that biological advantage time to coincide with the actual game time. The other thing to keep in mind is that as this has changed with age. So younger players tend to be night owls. If you have teenagers at home, they're biologically, they're wired to be night owls. As the player ages, that becomes less of an issue, and they start becoming morning people. And so when you're giving instructions to your entire team, you have to keep all these small things into account because there are individual variations. Okay, so that was the science part. So now with that background, I want to talk just a little bit about jet lag and travel and athlete. So the whole goal when I'm working with a team is really to help them manage the fatigue that might build up during the season, right? So jet lag, very simply, when people ask me, what does jet lag mean? Remember we talked about your circadian clock, and we talked about how every day it's reset by exposure to light and dark. So your biological clock is synchronized to your local time. So for example, Sam, yours is localized, yours is synchronized to Massachusetts time right now. Mine's, in East Coast, so Detroit time. When you take a jet and you rapidly cross time zones, your circadian rhythms now lag behind. And when you get to the new time zone, they're scrambling because they're trying to get synchronized to the new time zone. And that causes all the symptoms of jet lag, which is, either you have difficulty falling asleep, or you have difficulty maintaining sleep, or you may be sleepy during the time when you really want to be awake. So that's the definition of jet lag. Now there is one way you couldn't get jet lag. So if you took a ship and you travel from, if you travel from, you took a transatlantic ship and went from the East Coast to Europe, because you'd be going slowly, and typically it takes one time zone, one day per time zone to get adapted, you wouldn't get jet lag. But that would be completely impractical. And we know that athletes travel quite a bit. So the goals are, number one, of course, is to manage that jet lag. And so jet lag is basically, you want to help them to rapidly resynchronize their biological rhythms to the new time zones so that they can sleep properly, they can get well rested, they can be alert. Plus you want to correct that misalignment of that performance time, that peak performance time they have to the local game timings. You want to align those two things. But also the other major goal also is travel fatigue. So oftentimes, you don't have to cross time zones to get fatigued from travel, right? So for a Detroit team, typically if you flew from here to, let's say, somewhere in Florida to play a night game, then flew back, and then the next day flew to Washington, and then flew Washington DC, and then flew back, and then played a local game, and then flew to New York City, and then flew back, and then played another local game before you flew to Toronto and you came back. So you did these, 6 games but they were all on the same coast. It still can be, that can still disrupt your sleep. That can still cause fatigue. And that sleep disruption can result in impairment in performance. The other thing is that, just by being in the airplane, because the planes are slightly hypoxic and it's slightly uncomfortable, you're out of your, normal comfort zone, that itself can result in fatigue accumulating. So whenever, again, whenever we're talking about how to help teams or athletes adjust to new time zones, the simplest way to understand is to use the light exposure or light avoidance. So, very, very simply put, if you get, if this is your sleep time, bright light at night will make you go to bed later and wake up later. So it shifts your clock, right? So if I wanted to go from Detroit to California and I wanted to go to bed later, I would expose myself to bright light in the evening, because that would help shift and help me get used to it. But if I was coming from California back to Detroit, bright light in the morning will make you go to bed earlier. So the other thing is that even though strategic exposure and avoidance of light is the main way you can shift somebody's clock, in athletes, it's also important to remember that timed exercise or training, as well as meal timings, also help you adapt to the new time zone wherever you are. So, which means that, for example, if you cross some time zones and get to the new destination, you want to be careful because remember remember how we talked about every organ in your body having a clock. So even your stomach, your liver, your intestines, your pancreas, all of them have a clock. And so you might be hungry at a time which is not appropriate at the local destination. So you want to try, and eating at meals at the right time at the local destination will help you get acclimatized to the new time zone earlier. It's also very important to talk to athletes about the timing of exercise. So we know that if you exercise earlier in the day, it makes you more, it makes you wake up earlier. If you exercise late at night, then we were just talking about it before we started recording, some of the players can't fall asleep because they've just played, they're all stimulated, it'll make you go to bed later. And this is important when you're crossing time zones. So I'll give you an example. So I was working with an NBA player, and he was from the East Coast. So whenever he'd go to the West Coast, he'd wake up too early. So he'd wake up around 7 a.m. His, local time, which is East Coast time, which was about 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning in California. But because he's awake, he'd decide to exercise. He'd think that, well, if I get up and I start exercising, it's going to tire me out. But it does exactly the opposite. Exercise is stimulating, so it's going to wake him up. So that's just something to keep in mind. How am I doing on time?
Yeah, you're good, Meeta.
Okay.
Keep rolling.
Okay. So when people are crossing time zones, the first question you want to ask is, do you want to adapt or not adapt? Because remember, like I said, it takes about 1 day per time zone to adapt. It's easier to adapt when you're going westwards, and so westward it could even be half a day to adapt, especially for younger people who are night owls. So it's going to be more difficult for morning people. And so if it's a very rapid trip in which you're going to be there for about 4 or 5 days only, or you're going to be there for a total of 3 days, it really doesn't make any sense to adapt at all. And I'll show you an example of where I've used that in the past. That is actually becoming less relevant now with the new changes that the NBA, especially in the US, has done. So now when you go on a road trip, you go and you stay on that coast for a few days before you decide to come back, and you're not randomly flying from one place to the other. And so then you can try to adapt. But sometimes, for example, last year actually I worked with the national was it last year? Yeah, the Belgium national football team. When they were flying from Belgium to Kazakhstan for a match, and they were going only for 4 days. And so then, and then we planned how they would not adapt to it. They would try to stay on Belgian time all the time while they were flying too, and while they were there, because and it was easy to do because their game timings, they were still able to play their games, etc. And it's always easier to do that when you're traveling east. So, I've talked about circadian clocks, and I just want to show you this example so that you understand. So this is not your regular clock time. Just to orient you, this is midnight. This is a 24-hour clock. Midnight, this is 6 in the morning. This is noon. And this is 6 p.m. So if you're on the East Coast time, typically if you're playing an NBA game, it starts maybe at 7:20, right? And players are going to bed anywhere from, I don't know, 12:30 to 2 or 3 in the morning. And then they wake up between 8 and 9 to be at the facility, right? This is their sleep time. This is the time they have a game. When you fly in from the West Coast, so remember your biological clock is still set to the West Coast time. It's still synchronized there. Now, the game time is really not a problem because the game is now early and it's about 3 o'clock your time, back home time. But it's the problem is that if they're trying to go to bed now here, which would be 1 or 2 in the morning local time, for them it's between 10 and 11 at night. And most of them are not sleeping at that time, especially if they've played a game, right? Because they're trying to fall asleep at a time which is 3 hours before their normal time. That is very difficult to do. And the other thing is that they are also now, if they wake up at 8 a.m., they're actually waking up at 5 a.m. for their clock, which is set back home. And so, I can give you an example. So there was in this case, there was last year I helped a team, actually not last year, this year, before we shut down. And what they did is that they were playing a local game. The schedule was as follows. They played a local game at 7:20 on a Saturday. And then on Sunday, they were going to board a flight to first travel to Miami, where they would play on Monday night. And then on Wednesday, they were playing in Atlanta. And then they were, 2 days later, again, they were playing on another East Coast team. And so they were playing two more games on East Coast before they were going somewhere in the Midwest before they were flying back. And the two things the GM told me is that, first of all, when players go to Miami, they don't sleep anyways. They're not going to come to bed on time because they'd like to be out in the evening. So in that case, the recommendation was, first of all, to get well rested. So they had a string of home games. And so home stands are always a great time to get enough sleep. So they got to make sure that you get onto that plane well rested. And then while they were here, especially the first couple of days, to make sure that they would try to go to bed between 3 and 4 in the morning and then wake up. And so they wouldn't wake up before 11. That meant that you had to make sure that they did not, nothing was scheduled. Breakfast wasn't served before that. Housekeeping did not come to knock at their doors to tell them that they wanted to come in. So their sleep time was protected, and they were able to play too. And then of course, there were a few players who, because they'd have to miss their mid-afternoon nap, and that was difficult for them. And so, we had to work separately for them. Now, here I wanted to just give you an example of what happens when the East Coast teams goes to the West Coast. So on the West Coast, when you're playing, again, this is game time, 7:30. So when you come from the East Coast, now when, game time, when it's 7:20, it's actually 10:20 for East Coast. And so their biological advantage has already started to ebb. So it completely makes sense why, it'd be difficult for them to get adjusted. Now, it's not that difficult for them to fall asleep, but it's difficult for them to stay asleep, because now they're trying to stay asleep when the sun's out, or when their clocks are already telling them to wake up. So with those two hopefully simple examples, when we think about what sort of recommendations to give to our teams, you want to think of recommendations in 3 phases. Something you do before even getting on the flight, what you do while you're flying, and what you do once you get to the destination for the game. And in the pre-flight game, that you can do I do a bunch of evaluations when I go in to work with players, but it's also very important to talk about sleep banking, which is this idea that whenever you're going to get less sleep, you want to fill your bank with sleep, right? So for example, if I knew that I was going to be on call over the weekend, the worst thing I could do to myself would be to get less sleep Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, leading up to the weekend, because then I would start out with a pot which is already empty. So you want to explain you want to educate the players and make sure that they get enough. Getting onto that plane well rested is their best defense, because when you're traveling, you're likely to get less sleep. And the one way that you can fight that is by getting enough sleep before you even get on that plane. Also, choosing what time the flight timing is. I would recommend any time where you can spend the entire night and take a flight which doesn't take off before 2 in the afternoon. That's always helpful, because they've had a full night of sleep before they've got onto the plane. Sometimes, then I know in Europe, melatonin is not over the counter, but sometimes you can use melatonin to help sleep, because there is a case in which you can even shift clocks prior to getting to the destination zone. But this is very, very difficult in team sports, especially in the NBA, because they're regularly playing sports. So whenever I give interventions, I like to work with the team physician and the athletic trainers, because they know what sort of medications that they may have if they need to use them. But even on the flight, if you're taking a long haul flight, the first thing you do is you set your clock, your watch, to the new destination time, and now you're supposed to eat and sleep and do whatever, like as if you're already there. And so it's important to create the right if they're supposed to nap, they should have access to neck pillows and noise cancelling headphones, eye masks. Mostly NBA here in the US, their planes are pretty comfortable. It's a matter of education, because I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but alcohol and caffeine both are not good for you, and they worsen jet lag when you're on the plane. And if you can't sleep, maybe practice body-mind rest. Also, strategically using sunglasses so that you don't get accidentally exposed to light, especially if that's part of the protocol. And then once you're at the destination, again, detailed recommendations of what time they should go to sleep, what time they should wake up, what naps they can take, and when they should take those nap opportunities, meal timings, light exposure, etc. But overall, the framework for recommendation really has to be, although the science behind it is really complex, you want to make it very simple for the player to understand. And it has to begin with education. It has to begin with education, because you can give whatever information you need to, but the player has to decide whether they're going to, stop playing that video game, or, they have to make up their mind that they're going to be ready to sleep. And you have to give information almost like, oftentimes when they're traveling, I like to bring up the example of, it's like treating a cold. So when you're treating the common cold, you often don't treat the actual virus. You're just treating all the symptoms that are associated with it. So you give something for the headache, you give something for the fever, you keep them well hydrated. Similarly, when they're traveling, even if it's too difficult for them to shift and get adjusted to the new jet lag, to the new destination, you can give them tools that will allow them to maximize rest at night, that will help maximize their alertness during the day, and even just doing that is helpful. So with just that background, I hope I hope people understand that being an athlete really is a 24-hour profession. It's not just what you do during the day. It's really, what you do those 8 hours at night or 9 hours, it really does matter. And that every aspect of athletic performance is affected by sleep. And you must pay attention to your sleep, because those deficits, they tend to accumulate. And remember how I showed you those graphs in which if you get less sleep, you get tired and it keeps getting worse? Well, the one thing that happens is that if you get less sleep on a regular basis, your self-awareness of being sleepy does not parallel that. So you lack that sense of self-awareness, and as a result, people don't make an effort to play catch up. Also, that circadian rhythms really affect every physiological function, and they're key to athletic performance. And simple, non-gimmicky science can be used to help them. And with that, I'm just going to end it right here.
Awesome, Meeta. That was excellent. I have some questions for you.
Yes.
I took a lot of notes. So I think, like, it seems there's two ways to attack it, right? We can try and approach it with the player, the athlete,
Mm-hmm.
and or try and approach it with the coaching staff.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think probably both of them have influence on ultimately the player's sleep, right? And I was always that NCAA performance coach who was like, first training session is going to be at 6 a.m. because we have to train the student athletes when they don't have class.
Right. Very bad man.
Right. So I'm like over here stepping over $100 bills to pick up quarters.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, we gotta train. We can't miss training sessions. We can't miss training sessions. So I guess my question for you is, if you're talking to a coach, someone who's in charge, could be a head basketball coach, could be the performance coach, whatever, someone who's in charge of making some decisions based around the schedule, like, how would you approach it? What would be some like macro ideas you would try and get across to them to optimize sleep patterns for the players, athletes?
So whenever I go into a team, I like to speak, the initial presentation I like to do to the entire team. And I think that makes, you really want to involve the entire team, because obviously you need coaches, you need a coach's buy-in, because coaches decide what time they want to call the players in. You want players to understand, because again, sleep is something personal and, something that they're doing on their own time. And then you want the front office to be involved, because if you decide to tell them that I would prefer if they spend an extra night here before flying, they played their last night game, I want them to spend that extra night and then take the next flight, but I want them to take that flight at about 1 PM so that they can get a full night of sleep before they even get onto the next plane. And that means that you pay for an extra hotel room for the entire, so that's money. And so you want the front desk, the front office to be involved for sure. So it begins with education. And, when you're speaking with players, focusing on the effect that this has on performance is one way to get a buy-in. That's what hooks them, right? If you get less sleep and if your circadian rhythms are out of sync, you're likely to develop health problems. Does a 22-year-old player care? No. All they want is to perform well. And so and for players, they have so many competing interests that you want to start out by making sure that the whatever education you give them, it's interactive, it's interesting, and then you can give them the how-to tools. And so the how-to tools is initially you give them a talk, and then as the season progresses, you regularly send them cues, whether it's how they get their sleep or what their schedule should be, and it has to be very simple to understand. It should fit on a piece of paper. It should be color coded so that it's easy to understand. And that's the only way to create a buy-in. Does that help? Now I'll tell you that, because many times coaches were players themselves, or when you talk to the coaches, they sort of relate to it, right? And then of course, you know, there are these broad talks that you can give to the entire team, but then you can also spend some time doing, you know, spending one-on-one speaking individually to athletes, talking about what they're trying to do. And you know, specifically in the NBA, I mean, I'm sure you've heard, it's called the NBA sleep. You know, they have a lot of issues, and especially when rookies come in, you know, that's a good time to really talk to them, because, you know, if you don't get somebody to speak to them, they're going to talk with other players, and, you know, other players might tell them information which is maybe correct or maybe hit or miss. And sometimes information, because it's so personal, it might not be something that fits into this player's profile. And so, for example, a lot of young players, as you know, Sam, they get there earlier. They actually get there earlier than the older players, because they want to make sure that they're there on time. And younger players are the night owls. So they really need that extra 1 hour of sleep. And, you know, it's only education that will help move that.
Love it. Great points.
I have a question too, Meeta.
Yeah.
I wrote a lot of, that was fantastic. First of all, it was incredible. I was like, it's like Christmas for me. But one of the things that was mentioned in the questions too, I know we will cover them at the end, but it was a common theme, and because I also have this question, banking, what is your philosophy on banking? How much can you make up for lost sleep? And is it the same as if you would not have to make up? But because there's a lot of controversy, some may claim that you can perfectly make it up in 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, in a few hours, maybe just one nap will do it. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, so let me answer that question in a few points. So the first thing is that whenever you make up for lost sleep, it's not a simple mathematical sleep thing. So if for this week, instead of getting 8 hours, I got 6 hours in bed. So from Monday to Friday, so I was sleep deprived by 2 hours every day. That means I have 10 hours of sleep debt. I don't need to make up by getting 10 hours in sleep, because what happens is that your brain, and it does it by us, you don't need anything to do it, your brain is wired to produce more deep sleep. So deep sleep is driven by sleep pressure and the homeostatic drive, and it's restorative. So it'll make up, so the quality of your sleep will change when you're in recovery sleep. So deep sleep will recover first, and then dream sleep will recover. So that's just the way that it happens. Now, the second thing I want to clarify is that when we as sleep scientists say banking sleep, it's not, it's not like traditional banking in which you can consume more than your sleep need. So what I'm saying is that if I was you can't really consume more than your sleep requirement. But everybody typically is walking around with some amount of sleep debt. So sleep banking basically means you're playing catch up before you know you're going to do this all over again, right? So you are making sure you get enough sleep, and so you're no longer sleep deprived before you start another bout in which you're aware you might develop, you might get sleep deprived again. So that's how banking, and that's based on, so there are studies that show that there was at least one particular study in which they showed that if you took people who slept well and did not have any sleep deprivation, so they had banked sleep, versus those who were already sleep deprived, and then you sleep deprived both these groups, the ones who had enough sleep did better. So they were more resilient to the effects of sleep loss. That's why you want to do sleep banking. Now, the third thing I want to tell you is that, effectively what most people were doing prior to the stay-at-home orders from the pandemic is that, over the week work days, they'd get sleep deprived, then they would play catch up on the weekend, they would get extra sleep, then they would do, they would repeat this cycle. that overall, yes, it's bad for you. It's so that is not a way you want to live regularly. However, that is the only way to approach sleep in the NBA, because there is no way, because irregularity and getting less sleep is a part of life. And so the only way you can compensate for that is by banking sleep. You know, if you get sleep deprived, then playing catch up by taking extra naps and, sleeping longer. So it's not ideal, but it is what we have. It's
the first best alternative.
Yes. And it's better than somebody who says, well, forget, I'm losing games, I'm not doing well, I'm just going to get 5 hours anyway. So it's, you just have to keep trying to come back to baseline.
I really like your points, like your emphasis on the lighting as the primer stimulant of resetting your circadian clock, which is with our team last year, we really emphasized that, for example, already in the locker room. You try to have dim lights as soon as the game was over. And some were really not aware, I think, from speaking with athletes, how important it really is. I remember a conversation where they would laugh a little bit of like, well, that's not really going to help, but it actually did as we intervened with brighter light in the morning and dimmer light in the evening. And I've applied it to myself as well, and it's incredible because as I reflect more during this pandemic, it's interesting to see how far we've come from the natural environment, from waking up with the sunrise and going to bed with the sunset, because of the whole industrialized system that we're in. And I think.
Well, can I make a point there? So just a couple of points. Number one, I want to tell you is that because of the way that our eyes evolved, there are a couple of things to take into account. So the lux of light, so the brighter the light, and that is it's a more powerful effect on your clock. The wavelength spectrum of light is also important. So blue-green wavelength is also very important. So blue-green is better than is more powerful in affecting your clock as compared to yellow-red light. So, for example, you can see firelight, you can see candlelight, right? You can see it, but your biological clock cannot see it. So firelight and candlelight does not shift your biological clock. And so we were involved. And so in response to your question, yes, we were. So there was a study, it was done in Colorado, and they took a bunch of participants, and some of them were night owls. So they were going to bed at, really late at night and then waking up midday. And they took them in Colorado. It was an outdoor camping study, and they had no exposure to artificial light. And towards the end of this experiment, they were all sleeping. These night owls were actually sleeping earlier, because night owls, one of the things they found is that night owls actually are extra sensitive to light. So, so night owls, your younger players may be wired to be night owls, but because if you tell the player that, you have to go to bed at midnight or 1 o'clock, and they're absolutely not ready to go to sleep, what are they going to do? They're going to, the way people relax is by, the internet or social media or, handheld devices or video games, etc. And so that worsens the problem. And so that's compounding the problem. So that's just something to keep in mind. And so, I'll tell you a couple of things. Is number one is to dim. There is a way that you can dim the light from these backlit devices. Maybe you can wear glasses that block green spectrum of light. They're orange colored glasses. You can use them. But also to understand that, there's also an interactive, because it's not just the light, it's just the interaction itself that keeps you stimulated and prevents you from falling asleep.
Nice.
Meeta, I got a really specific question for you. Okay, let's say 7 p.m. tip off, 9:30 p.m. game is over. Let's just use a home team. Okay, so they have the resources, they have the facilities available.
Mm-hmm.
Game is over at 9:30.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just assume it's a practice day the next day. Like, I would love to just kind of see what goes through your mind on if you would take a specific player, and I get it can be a little individualistic,
Mm-hmm.
but what are some actionable steps, things you would do with that player, with food, maybe some breathing, maybe anything
Mm-hmm.
to optimize sleep that night?
So it really depends on what the players do. So first of all, there may be press right after, and then there may be some stretching exercises, etc. They should eat there, and then drive home, because you don't want them to be sleepy while they're driving home. You want them to start winding down after they've gotten home. Now most players so first of all, it's very important to set a realistic bedtime. So there may be a few players who are ready to go to bed by 12:30, but many of them are not. And telling them to go to bed at 12:30 is, they're going to think that that's what they want to do, and they're going to want a pill to help them fall asleep. So first of all, you have to have a very realistic bedtime. And it might be, especially after a game, because they've had all that caffeine. And remind me to talk about caffeine after this. They may not be ready to sleep, but let's assume they want to sleep, they want to get to bed by 2:30. I would say that they need to develop a winding down schedule. Now, how we use alarm clocks in the morning to remind us to wake up? I would say set an alarm at night to say, well, okay, now I'm deciding that I'm done with all the things I've done to distract myself, to help me relax, etc., etc. Now I have to get ready to go to bed. And this could be, half an hour or 45 minutes, maybe an hour for some people, because especially for players, because they're so high strung. They're physiologically, they're so aroused that it's really difficult for them to sort of calm down. And so and then at that point, when they get into bed, or before they get into bed, I would say a hot shower or a hot bath. And that's important to be hot, because when you get out of a hot shower, your body temperature falls, and that's what naturally helps to your circadian rhythm. It's a signal to your brain that you're ready to sleep. Maybe something quiet like maybe some stretching exercises, maybe some this is a good time for meditation. Or if players have praying as part of what they do, this is a good time to do that. Some players I know, they do Bible, they read the Bible, etc. That's a good time to do that. So anything that's kind of relaxing. And really, that part of the time has to be electronic free, which means you can't be on your phone, you can't be interacting. And so sometimes I tell players to read a book, and you'd be surprised at how many players are able to read a book. And they'll say, well, Dr. Singh, when I fall asleep as soon as I was doing homework. Well, then read a book. You'll have to find something that might help you. But a good way to find out what works for you is to ask the player themselves. And they will, when you talk to them, and then run this scenario with them. And, by trial and error, they will come up with a schedule that's going to, or a nighttime winding down schedule that's going to work for them. But the number one thing is to have a very realistic expectation. So, for a player who normally, on non-game days can sleep at 2:00 and post-game cannot sleep till 3 or 4 in the morning, that's okay. That's okay, because they know the next day is going to be a shorter, they can sleep in a little bit more. They can practice, they can go back, and they can nap again. The player has to understand that sleep has to be allowed to happen. You can't command yourself to fall asleep. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have any?
I could ask you questions all day about this.
Likewise.
But I think,
I want to take, is it Stephen's time?
yeah, if you want to switch gears and
Yes.
and we can maybe revisit some of this at the end.
Huh?
But that was awesome.
Thanks, Meeta. That was really good. You guys can hear me now, yeah? I've got the headset on. Great. I just had to change from no headset to headset. The daughters are up and about in the background, so look out. They'll be looking to do their thing. So we might move into the next prezzo straight off the bat, like really just looking at moving into some recovery. So you guys can see the screen, yeah?
Yep.
All good?
Yes.
Fantastic. Righto. So as I had mentioned earlier, like, look, just once again, thanks to Sam and Thomas for the opportunity for Meeta and I to talk. It's a topic that we both are very passionate about, and there's a lot of information we'd like to share, but we're cognizant of the fact the ultimate goal is to provide some practical take-homes for the audience that they can look at working with and implementing in their practice. So my take is moving into the recovery space, so really looking at creating a recovery framework for the MBA. And what I want to do is draw on some experiences from a variety of means. So we'll talk about some of the work that we've achieved, obviously, in the national landscape, in the National Basketball League within Australia, with the teams we've worked with there. At international level, the work we've done with international teams, and we'll highlight a couple of case studies from Scotland basketball in particular with the Commonwealth Games. And then we'll look at the variety of means of recovery strategies that are available. But if we just, as a, tagging on to Meeta's last response there about the individualization effect, everyone's an individual and nobody enjoys anything more than being heard. So if I can emphasize anything from the start, it's communicate with your athletes and listen to them, because they will tell you, they will give you the ideas of what works best for them. So with that in mind, there's a few things, really 4 areas I want to touch on. We're going to really have a brief look at the seasonal demands in relation to scheduling. We will highlight the recovery framework. We'll look at some recovery point systems we've used, and then provide you guys with some strategies to implement these. So really the schedule for the MBA and the travel involved, which Meeta has touched on briefly. I want to delve in, obviously, at the end with Sam and Thomas and Meeta about the recovery logistics, and then what's the biggest challenge that we face. With our recovery framework, looking at some specific considerations, how do we engage these players? And we've already mentioned the importance of individualization. We'll discuss the recovery point system and specifically some of the work we've been able to do around the recovery points checklist and how that's where the genesis was to the current framework that we use. And I'll provide a few case studies. And then ultimately, how do we put this all together? And then we'll finish off with a final word from Paddy Mills with his take on recovery. Because ultimately, yep, we're trying to create a recovery framework for the NBA or professional basketball environment. And our key is one objective. And that objective should always to be engaging the players in proactive recovery strategies. And a part of that recovery space is obviously the presentation by Meeta just then on sleep, but we'll look at other strategies where our goal is to have these players contribute proactively in the process. So the seasonal demands, let's look at the NBA itself. So obviously we know it's a very condensed scheduled season, so 82 games. And I'm going to refer back to the 2017-18 season. I know things have changed a little bit now with less back-to-backs and so forth. But really 82 regular season games, 177 days, potentially 25 playoff games over 65 days. And if we just look really at the travel, now in this instance, once again, going back to that season, the average for the NBA was 44,000 miles covered. And if you look at the table on the right-hand side, we're looking at the top 10 teams in relation to distance traveled. So if you go to the Blazers at the top, traveling 54,000 miles. As you can see there, what does that mean? That's as the equivalent of flying from Chicago to Cleveland every single day for 176 consecutive days. So Meeta mentioned travel fatigue, and I'm going to use the term travel weary. So we're going to really look at what is the weariness effect of this consecutive consolidated travel schedule. What does that mean in relation to the real world? Well, the world's circumference is 29,000 miles. So put that in perspective to the amount of travel that these guys are actually required to do to perform their occupation. And then ultimately for that particular year, if we go back to that 2017-18 season, there was a 31% increase in games lost due to injury. And if you look at the quotes here by a former retired head athletic trainer, the travel miles, sleeping on planes and in hotels for months on end, and playing 82 games in roughly 170 days takes their toll on the players' bodies. Unfortunately, we may never really see what these guys can really do because they're tired all of the time because of their schedule. So that really sets the scene now for the importance of physiological, psychological, and social recovery. So we're now going to take it a little bit further, looking in particular at one schedule here. So we'll use the example in this situation. This was the actual schedule for the Sacramento Kings. So once again, let's break this schedule down and see what does it really mean in relation to home games and away games. So first off, in this particular schedule, the Kings face 16 back-to-backs. If we look at road tripping, they had 6 road games in a particular part of the season in 12 days. So that was the worst case scenario for the team, 6 road games in a 12-day stretch. Frequent flyer miles, 49,000. So a lot of travel. And one of the points that Meeta and Sam were talking specifically about was the impact of this on rookies. This is an extremely important consideration, especially in the rookies' professional transition, coming from, an NCAA tournament situation, upwards of 30 odd games thereabouts. And now you're going to the rookies that are trying to impress. And Meeta made this point earlier on, that there's a tendency for rooks to do more, to put more shots up, to spend more time on the floor in an effort to get that competitive edge. So in doing so, they may not devote appropriate amount of time to mental and physical recovery. So once again, that sets the scene when we look at the schedule and the travel. So now the logistics. So if we're trying to look at what are the logistics of actually recovery within season, and we're going to use one of the actual weeks from that particular schedule. So this is a hypothetical scenario for that season, but this is the actual schedule that was undertaken by the Kings. 5 games in 7 days with 2 back-to-backs. So once again, if you have a look roughly at what would occur on these days. So on the 11th of March, they would have had potentially a shoot around. Some players may have done some top-ups with some strength work. Then they have a game and they would depart that night, heading over then to OKC. Next morning, there may have been a video session, potentially small time on feet with shoot around, play the game. And so we would have had a chance then to do some recovery post that game, given that the next day was scheduled travel day. So the next day, the guys were back on putting some shots up. Potentially, that would be one opportunity for us to provide some decent strength work, as strength and recovery are 2 areas that during season, it's about microdosing these aspects when we can. Moving on to the 14th, no shoot around as they've gone into now changing over to a game in Miami. So they would have had obviously their walkthrough, which may have been just video, played a game. We have a time for some recovery at the end. On the 15th, a travel day. So once again, the guys are on court, potentially a top up with some strength work and then flying out. The next game on the 16th against the Warriors. So once again, video, fly out that night. Next day, game against the Jazz, recovery that night. So as you can see, when you start to break down the day-to-day schedule, it's very challenging to put in appropriate amounts of recovery at specific times due to the travel schedule. I'm a framework-based person. I really like to see how these things connect and how the dots all join. So really, if we look at this framework by Huyghe and his team on providing a brief idea, ultimately we have practice and competition. And we need to ensure that our athletes are on the floor for both of these things. So one thing our goal initially is to embed a recovery framework or model that really engages the players in this process. So we both have short-term and long-term training and competition goals that we need to achieve. And then we also have pre, during, and post-training and competition practices where we need to engage the players. As we mentioned earlier, this is individualized. So the players will tell you what works for them. We go through a process, and in this particular model, we're trying to look at what works for the players, providing them strategies and tools they can use that they feel are of value to help them perform. A part of that will be some load monitoring practices and looking at the individualized responses to the acute training and competition stimulus from the players, and then the impact of other effects such as travel, sleep quality, nutrition, hydration, and those means. A part of your process in relation to the load monitoring factors that you look at is around injury prevention, and recovery can help obviously with aiding in the injury prevention process. But the most important thing here is it's going to be determined by your roster characteristics. So we would use some athlete clustering. One of the clustering methods I use specifically with the teams that we go into is our quantification of player groupings. And I use the terms Ferraris, Bentley, Jaguars and Bentleys. So how I look at the strategies for my young buck, which is a Ferrari, will be completely different to my 15-year vet who is a Bentley. And then my guys in that transition period, that 3 to 5 year period, they will be my Jaguars, because their developmental process throughout that is going to be different. So we'll use a different approach for each of those. Now, one strategy that we've used successively in the past has been the 100-point weekly recovery checklist to tie these areas all together, because our main goal, once again, is to engage the players in this process. So the 100-point weekly recovery checklist, if I go back to the establishment, we established this in 2007 for the Indonesian Olympic team in the lead up to the 2008 Olympic Games. Now, this particular model was an education-based model where we targeted and challenged the athletes to accrue 100 points each week in recovery. We're going to come back to that, but I just wanted to highlight it right then. Because as performance coaches, one of the things you need to be aware of is, what is your recovery pyramid? What does that look like for you in your environment? For me, there are 4 key areas. We look at neural, muscular, psychological, and substrate recovery. They're my big rocks that I want to try and highlight. Now, of those, obviously my mainstays, which for me are my 90% of what I do, the framework or the base of my pyramid, as Meeta has already described, sleep is most important for us. Nutrition and hydration is the other component, and then obviously psychological wellness and well-being. They're 3 non-negotiables with any program that we walk into to try and establish early on. Then following on from that, it's the 10%. It's the other things that are out there. And we make those other 10% recovery strategies out of the recovery checklist. So we will have a multitude of strategies available for athletes. And once again, given their individual nature, they have the choice to auto-regulate what things they feel work best for them. Because in that recovery checklist, that's where we're trying to find the 1%ers that count. The 1%ers that make a difference to making that athlete feel fresh psychologically and light physically. So one of the case studies I'll present to you now is briefly how we modified the recovery checklist for the Commonwealth Games with Scotland basketball. I just want to highlight this particular group of athletes specifically. They've gone down and achieving something that hasn't been achieved for a significant amount of time for Scotland at a Commonwealth Games level. First and foremost, they had their first victory over England at the Commonwealth Games in 34 years. In game 1, in the pool rounds, they were facing their nemesis. The team was able to come together and have the first win. So think about that for a moment. The first win over another nation for 34 years was massive. They went on to exceed all expectations and make the medal rounds. And ultimately, in a very close playoff for the bronze medal, lost to New Zealand. That was the first time in Scotland Commonwealth Games history that a team sport had made the medal rounds. And it really is a credit to head coach Rob Beveridge, high performance manager Barry Lang, and his crew and staff for what they're able to do. From our perspective, when we're looking at recovery and freshness, we modified the recovery checklist specifically. So instead of, as I mentioned earlier, a 100-point system, which is where we start with the recovery checklist as an educational tool, in an intensified competition schedule, we are now really targeting a 24-hour recovery period. When we designed the recovery checklist initially, we looked at all of the literature to determine and quantify the efficacy, number 1, of the recovery strategy. What was the research around each of the strategies? And then 2, what was the proactive nature that required the athlete to engage in the strategy? those two areas were the main key factors for us aligning a point system for each of the recovery areas. Now, I'm sure you'll all agree, for me, my athletes are simplistic creatures in the fact that they respond well when you challenge them with targets. So we have a target number here, which may range from 8 to 12 points in that 24-hour period. So the athlete needs to accrue a set number of points in recovery over that period of time. And then we'll display this, as Meeta highlighted earlier on, we will display this in a very simplistic traffic light graphic for the athlete to see where they are in relation to, once again, using a term that Meeta had used, banking their recovery. We will come back to the specific recovery modalities. This is just a selection, and I'm sure that the audience will be able to add to this with other recovery modalities. Now I want to show you from a professional league level, so working in the National Basketball League in Australia. Obviously, our competition schedule is not as intense as what you would find in relation to the game demands, in relation to game density as the other leagues, so the EuroLeague or obviously the NBA. This particular graphic, a last second win where Huyghe Jet, and I know that Brent, the strength coach at that stage with the Crocs, was there with this particular game where they knocked off Adelaide in the very last second. Huyghe getting a nice flush to Nick Kay. So let's have a look here at breaking down the recovery point system as a whole. So in this particular graphic, you're going to see on the horizontal axis, we have player wellness. Every team will look at some type of wellness scale where there'll be some subjective measures that the player will determine, okay, how do I feel today? My level of soreness, my sleep, my vigor, my energy, my mood. They will look at some of those factors to come up with a particular composite index score, which will generate a player wellness percentage. On my vertical axis, we have the recovery points that the players are to accrue. So you can see in this particular graphic, we had some players who were down less than our 30 points, so 2 days, 48 hours. So we were targeting 15 points a day in this 48-hour post-game recovery period. You can see where they are, but if we run a correlation coefficient statistic, we can see here in this particular graphic that if I'm targeting a wellness percentage score for the players of 60%, obviously players are always have a level of fatigue or always carrying injuries. They're never going to be 100%. So our index wellness threshold was set at 60%. If our players were 60% more on that threshold, we were happy. And if we look at that, that equates to around 30 recovery points. So I can even know that if my players come in when we do our surveys on their recovery points, if they're at 30 points, they're going to be around that 60% wellness or more. But if we look at the R-stat, so really looking here at this correlation coefficient itself, and the analysis reveals that the R-stat and the correlation coefficient determines what percentage one variable has an impact on the other. So in this particular scenario, where we look at the perceptual wellness, we can see that an R value of 0.78, so 78% of the variance within player wellness is accounted for by the recovery points accrued. So more than 2/3 of this value is accounted for by the recovery points. So once again, just providing an indication for us that when we look at these particular recovery strategies in our models, that we can certainly move in a direction to help us making educated decisions. All right, moving on to the 1%ers that count. So we said earlier on that there's a high level of individualization in relation to what strategies are used by who likes to use what things. Our goal is to come up with really 4 or 5 key strategies that we feel are highly valuable in that the level of efficacy is really high and the practical application for the athlete is also one of the key concerns. So I'm not going to talk about sleep. Meeta has done a great job looking at sleep as a whole. What I will touch on though is really, if you're talking to your athletes, talking about sleep hygiene. And once again, sleep hygiene has been covered a lot because we know that sleep deprivation can result in an inability to recover. So if you look at going back as far as Doc Rivers talking in 2008 and what it means to him in relation to throwing your game off. how athletes are squashed into, if we go back to the first slide with the schedule, into planes, disrupted sleep happens all the time. While I was at the Perth Wildcats in the National Basketball League, we established a sleep hygiene protocol in relation to a paper that we published looking really at our top sleep hygiene characteristics. So whether that be looking at the room lighting, athletes maintaining their regular schedule, if trying to have them fall asleep within 15 to 20 minutes. If not, what strategies can they use? Removing the clock, looking at their nutrition, which Meeta already highlighted. The bed is for sleep, no electric devices, looking at room temperature. So there's a series of things you can do in the sleep space to try and provide some guidance for athletes to work what works best for them. The second area that we focus a lot on is around mindfulness. We find that mindfulness is a key characteristic when it comes to psychological well-being. I'm going to break these things into two. One is a performance mindset, or the next play mindset, so to speak, and the other is their health and well-being aspect. So for us, mindfulness really helps to develop clarity in the moment. So this will improve a team's ability to execute, its ability to change directions confidently in the present moment, and allows players to control emotional reactivity. In some of the research we've done with professional basketballs in the National League, we've used some specific techniques around mindfulness work that has seen increases at a National League level in free throw shooting percentage of 37%. So once again, looking at things where I'm trying to have the athlete control their mind to aid with developing performance flow. We try and get them to concentrate their attentional field on the task at hand. We look at removing emotional reaction and negative responses to certain situations and trying to help them have a high calmness and clarity on task. So these are all strategies that we've used that really have been centered around mindset anchoring and using anchoring tools to keep them in the play present time. However, from a wellness perspective, mindfulness is a key component of emotional wellness itself. And that's really a person's ability to cope with daily circumstances and to deal with personal feelings in a positive, optimistic, constructive manner. And we all know that they're really areas that relate to growth mindset. So mindfulness is one of the key recovery areas that we focus on. We use an app called Smiley Mind, and you can download that. It's a free app, and it offers a variety of meditational pathways to help create that calmness. So Smiley Mind, if you're looking at particular apps, there's 1,000 out there, but that's just one that we've had experience using. All right, soft tissue management itself. So obviously, SMR, so some self-myofascial release as a recovery tool. Everyone's into it. There's several proposed benefits in relation to reducing local fatigue, trying to reduce excitability, increasing, inducing muscular relaxation, mood enhancement, joint ROM, postural resetting. There's a variety of proposed benefits. Recently, so last year, we were able to conduct some research with Dr. Eric Drinkwater and his crew, really looking at the impact of foam rolling, in particular on jump performance. So in this particular example, the athletes performed 125 eccentric leg extensions. So we induced DOMs, obviously, with that type of resistance stimulus. And then they did some triggering. So they did some SMR in relation to the quads, hamstrings, adductors. And what we found was the jump mechanisms were improved. So the counter movement jump at 72 hours, there was small to moderate effects observed there, and also observed at 48 hours post-training. So counter movement jump was improved at that time point, and that was associated with pain tolerance improvements at 48 hours also, and also observed at 24 and at 48 out post-training. So there was some mechanisms around improvements in pain tolerance and also jump performance. There was no clear evidence of neural contribution, but what we were suggesting was the improvement in jump performance was really facilitated in part by an increase in pain tolerance. So for us, when you look at the other soft tissue management treatments you have, we know that self-myofascial release and foam rolling is one that's used quite readily. We also look at in-game situations, so some recovery postures in particular. Well, this research comes from, D2 female soccer players. They did some HIT, so 4 minutes on the treadie, 95% max heart rate, 3-minute recovery. And in those recovery periods, they either had a hands on knees posture, so a recovery posture, or a hands on head. And we know that the bent hands on knees posture, there was significant improvements in reducing recovery heart rate. There was also improvements in ventilation mechanics, so things around the ventilation threshold itself, along with recovery from carbon dioxide, and tidal volume was also improved. But the main factor was a substantial improvement in the heart rate itself. So what the suggestions from this particular research showed, that there was accelerated intermediate recovery between exercise bouts by maximizing the surface area, where they talk about the diaphragmatic zone opposition, so a particular part of the thoracic cavity itself. And by optimizing that zone, we get improved in parasympathetic influences on the cardiorespiratory mechanisms by adopting this hands on knees posture during periods from high fatiguing intermittent activity. So as you'll see, there's a lot of athletes that are utilizing this type of posture recovery, and it's something that you see obviously repeatedly within the basketball setting. But ultimately, how do we engage players in this process? So for us, once again, tagging on what Meeta had said earlier, it really needs to be a results performance-based process. The athletes want to know, how is this going to affect my performance? Will this improve my performance? So we're talking about an on-court results-based improvement for the athletes. Getting more time on court, being fresher, making better decisions cognitively, being in a better emotional space, all of the factors that go into maximizing performance on court. The second key point when we look at engaging players is it's player-centered. The recovery protocols we put forward for that player is for that player only. There's an individual approach for every player. And a key component of that is obviously that it's education focused. So we need to do some educational work, whether it be one-on-one, small group, whole team, in coming up with the reasons behind we're doing what we're doing. We all know that knowledge is power. Players want to know what they're going to do is going to help them improve their performance on court. It's directed directly at them, so it's player-centered, and we've given them some education snippets so they have a brief understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. We also talk to the players a lot about standards, and we know that your lowest standards become your highest standards, and all these small things add up. So a part of our ethos when we go into the team, obviously we look at what is the current environment in relation to where they are with their team's values and standards. How can we assist in matching those and matching that vision? All right, the last thing. So one of the questions I saw in the chat was, how does this go? What would a generic day look like? So in this particular article, we're looking at complete readiness, where every hour counts. So what is it through the whole process? So here you're looking at off-season situation with a particular player, with when they're doing their gym workouts, court workouts. But what I want you to notice with this particular example is the focus on where they're placing recovery. So recovery is highly embedded in the day. So we have splashes of recovery at all of these times to help this player obtain complete readiness. And so this player describes it as it's a rhythm, it's a routine. I don't skip any of it. I don't skip any of the steps in this process. I eat when I'm supposed to eat. I sleep when I'm supposed to eat. I play dominoes when I'm supposed to do that. So coming back now, how we're going to put this into the program. Here's an example from Thomas and myself in relation to Basketball New Zealand. All we need to know with this particular graphic, there's a little bit of stuff on there. So our days, so each day, day 1 through to 14, this is a 14-day block. The weighting in relation to the size of the shaded area is the emphasis of that particular day. But what we do is we include recovery points within that day. We're including recovery points that day as that becomes a part of the whole framework itself. It's not something that's just tagged on at the end. So when we're looking at recovery points, tech, session intensity, volume, our goals for the day, this is all embedded within the one framework. Now, if we go back to the very beginning where we showed the weekly schedule with the Kings, so how are we now going to try and implement this in relation to the recovery integration during that particular week? So one of the first things we need to do is go back to your athlete clustering. How are you going to determine your players within their groups within that framework? So we were looking at high rotations, more than 24 minutes on court, mod rotations, low rotations. And if that's the case, then that's how we're going to quantify and provide your athlete clustering within those groups. It may be that my high rotation guys, we're targeting 16 points in recovery. Our mod rotation guys, 12 points thereabouts. Our low rotation guys, 8 points thereabouts. So based on that, the player has a specific number now that they know they're going to be trying to achieve in recovery based on their rotations. Just one more key consideration with that. It may be that your recovery strategies for your playing groups may be targeting a particular stress. So for my bigs, for example, they're banging bodies hard in the paint, you know, all game. So I might be more interested on what strategies are going to help with blunt force trauma, contact collision trauma. You know, for my wings, I might be more interested on the cardiovascular strain that those guys have been placed under. For my guards in particular, I might be thinking more about D cells and the mechanical stresses that are going through their system. So while we're looking at grouping in a high, mod, low rotations for our recovery to be a part of this process, I'm also considerate of what are the likely stresses and trauma that are unique to the positions that they play. So just another point in relation to when you're trying to compile your recovery modalities. All right. So think about your recovery goals. If we go back to our recovery checklist, I want to challenge my players to select 3 daily recovery strategies that work best for them. We will look at recording their recovery points, their daily recovery points, and you might have a specific target based on the previous slide of what you're trying to achieve with recovery. So with that in mind, I'm just going to throw over now to Thomas to, if you can see about that last, we had a bit of a technical issue there, so I'll throw over to Thomas now.
Okay.
So we're just looking at a media file that for some reason was not happy on my computer.
Okay. Here we go, guys.
It's all of that, to be honest, mate. And I think that's the...
You guys hear that?
Yep. Thank you.
Perfect.
It's all of that, to be honest, mate. And I think that's the next part of being a professional that I've really dug into, and I'm trying to get the young boys to understand that.
Seem to have lost it there, Thomas. You know, he's talking about the mindset, getting the players into recovery, focusing on their body, focusing on their mind. So we'll look at that. Right. I might go back to sharing my screen, Thomas.
Okay, one moment.
Thanks, man. So he was really just talking about all of the aspects in relation to being a professional athlete, what they do in relation to getting the younger players to trigger, looking after your body the right way, trying to play at a particular intensity on court, thinking your whole time about thinking in the mindset of recovery. So he goes through that in some detail. So with that in mind, like I just want to once again just thank IBPC for the opportunity to talk with Meeta and Sam and Thomas around that, and obviously acknowledge all the work that we do in this space. I don't think anyone can claim any of it as unique to them. We're all learning from each other. We have a lot of connections. A high level of networking goes on. So you can see on some of those slides, I've reached out to people in particular areas that have provided some input into what we're doing. But once again, open up to questions and look forward to working continuously now moving forward with IBPC.
Steven, excellent job, man. What really like caught my attention was this thought of engaging the players and having them drive the process. And just look like my reflection on this past season in the NBA, which wasn't even a full season, very limited experience. I noticed really quickly that everyone thinks what you think with the resources are, you got them. Like everything you could possibly have, right? Cold tub, hot tub, sauna, cryo chamber, sleep pods. Nutrition is at a very high level, fully functioning kitchen. But it's like, yeah, I guess the players will just kind of figure it out. Like they have these resources that they'll just connect the dots and put two and two together. And it's like, absolutely not. So I'm really interested to hear how you've had success on engaging the players, creating buy-in, showing them the value so they become more intrinsically motivated to take advantage of these resources and services.
That's the number one question we get asked across all of the professional teams we go into. How do you create player buy-in to a process? You know, and the teams that have done it, I'll give you a couple of examples. Teams that have done it extremely well and places we've been where it hasn't been received so well. And I don't want to use the cop-out, which is culture, right? It gets thrown around all the time. What's the culture within the organization? What are their goals? What's their values? What's their mission? But in what I can say, in the places and the environments I've been in where there appears to be a really well-aligned, well-articulated mission, values, goals, culture, those players, and especially the senior playing group, those teams, generally the senior playing group will be given a rook to look after, right? And it's the senior players that drive that. The junior players, when they first come into the league, so I know in that particular year with certain players being drafted into the Kings, you've got these guys that are coming in, and there was a couple of things that I've seen and heard through the series that have played where, you know, the rookies find that, man, once they get to that post All-Star break, like they struggle. That's usually a tipping point for a rook, and how they go about managing their body at that point. It's like that's when they then realize, hey, I'm in an 82 game season. This is now the travel weariness that starts to, all those things step in. So I think the benefits of highlighting, what does this do for performance? When did you perform well? What did we do in relation to preparing your body? In games where you felt you didn't perform to your maximum ability, what did we do or not do in preparing your body? So that individual approach is key to everything. When you learn to drive, that's a process, right? Like you learn to drive, you learn the road rules, you get on the road, you're in this complex situation, you're now making decisions. When you first get into professional sport, it's the same thing. What we want to do as performance coaches or the athlete mechanics is provide opportunities to ensure that we're getting all the information we need from the staff that we have to allow us to provide the right mechanical tools that we need to use to optimize performance for the playing group. So for us, keep it centered on performance outcomes for the player, keep it individualized to them, and then drip feed them some education so they know why they're doing what they're doing. And I think the biggest, my takeaway with the time I've had across multiple sports is there's a really good quote going around that life is very, very simple, but we as humans make it very complex. The same thing with my recovery with my players. The scientific portion, we can talk science all day long, and I'd love to sit down and have those discussions. But my players don't want to hear that. They want to say, man, how can I optimize my bang for my buck with value of time, because they're so time poor, because they've got so much time pressure on them from the moment the game ends to when they can get out of there. What can we do to try and make best value of that time? So let's not try and make it complex. Okay, keep it simple as much as possible. And if I just want to back onto, and one of the things that Meeta said earlier around the sleepiness, like we deal a lot with defining the difference with our players around sleep, in particular about consciousness and alertness. Like consciousness and alertness are two things. I can be conscious, so I'm in bed, I wake up, I need to go to the bathroom. I can do that task without being alert. I can make my way to the bathroom and then I can make my way back to bed. But if I start turning on the alertness centers in my brain, I wake up, I then pick up my phone and I look at my phone. I then turn my light on. I then go into the bathroom, I turn the light on. I then come back, and if you're like me, I'll then do the stupid thing of looking at the clock. And then I'll start doing backward math. Okay, if I go to sleep now, I've got 4 hours left. Or if I go to sleep now. So now all of this time, I'm turning on the alertness centers in my brain. So now my sleep latency is going to be pushed out. It's going to take me longer to regain sleep or go back to sleep now that I've turned on all these alertness centers. So for us, we talk a lot with our players around, okay, at sleep, if you have to do things, we've got issues with sleep, you need to look at not trying to increase the sleep, or the alertness centers within your brain. And those key things are around what Meeta said, around electronic devices. For us, we're very big on it. We've been in some teams where, you know, we would go to the hotel and we have a team room for the TV. And so we won't have TVs in the rooms. We have a computer room. So if you want to do computer work, you go to the computer room. So we try and encourage with our players that when they're at the hotel, the room is for sleep. We have these other areas set up for other activities, but let's associate that room with that. The hotel room is associated with sleep, not with being on your computer and watching TV and lazing about. And so we try and work on some of those aspects when we're on the road.
That's great. So, Thomas, I think you're muted.
Go ahead, Seth.
I've always been a big believer in, like, obviously recovery is important, but recovery is more important for the athlete who has a low aerobic capacity, previous injury, poor movement quality, poor body composition, poor maximal strength. It's like that person really needs recovery. And I've always been a big believer in, let's just build this robust athlete who is super resilient, who maybe is not so like dependent on recovery to get him through the season. So I guess my question is for you, Stephen, how do you, and you talked about it a little bit, but how do you cluster, stratify, identify athletes who are like, look, we got 2 games in 3 days, we got a back-to-back, and maybe you don't have that in your setting, but theoretically, say you do, we really got to make sure that we are on this player from a recovery standpoint. Like, do you do any sort of assessments in the beginning of the season to identify your higher risk athletes that may need more recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure that it's more recovery. It's and you use the word there, resiliency, right? So you hear it all the time. As a performance coach, we want to have the most resilient athlete. And we know the most resilient athlete is an athlete that has a certain amount of exposure of load. Now, yes, you go, okay, if it's too high or too low, and there's these changes with acute chronic workload ratios and that sort of thing. But what we know is that they're used to a certain level of loading. You know, NBA players are some of the most resilient athletes in the world, right? They're going to play every day. And what do they want to do when they're not playing? They want to play. They want to shoot. They want to put more shots up. They want to be on the court. So, yes, we would have a look. And most of the teams I've been in, we've been fortunate to have staff in those roles where they might look at some specific screening. We might have a biomechanist looking at some jump landing, looking at what's happening with, you know, valgus varus movements of the knee, what's happening at the low, you know, the kinetic chain in relation to the lumbopelvic hip complex. Where are they breaking down in a particular movement? Now, is that a strength deficit? All right. Is it a range of motion issue? What's causing those problems? And then obviously the strength coach is going to be the mechanic that's going to try and work on that particular area. Okay. We're going to have obviously, you know, our athletic trainers and soft tissue specialists working on trying to keep a certain amount of tone or regain a certain amount of tone, or reduce a little bit of tone, depending on if they've got some hypertonicity or excessive tightness in certain areas. With our jumping athletes, we know that that whole hip complex, all right, if we look at the ilias-psoas, the ITB, you know, glute med, that whole area is banged up and jammed. So is it a case of trying to manage that? If we try and manage that or release that at all, what does that do to then their posture and their running gait? So there's all these things are connected in some way. So from a recovery perspective, generally we want to look at the big box. So that stuff around sleep, mental wellness, nutrition. Okay, and we have one of the reoccurring themes, funny enough, this season more than other seasons that I've been involved, is there's been a high amount of interest this year in nutritional supplementation. All right, so whether it's the strategic use of caffeine, all right, whether it's, you know, for explosive sports, creatine is obviously something that's often, you know, tart cherry juice. Like there's a lot of things that this year I've been exposed to more questions around the nutritional supplementation strategies. You know, collagen ingestion with our athletes, you know, especially guys that are in more colder settings, so vitamin D supplementation. So there's been a lot more focus this year, funny enough, than more years around those type of strategies more than, you know, the physical or psychological strategies. At the moment, obviously, with isolation and lockdown, the mental health and wellness area is an area that we've invested heavily in staying connected with athletes. And one of the key things on a slide, we're in the process of writing a book called When Winning Matters, and we have a chapter in there called the 1 percenters. And one of the key 1 percenters we have in there is socialization. All right, we're all human beings, we're social creatures, and we like to do that. And Meeta referred to that earlier. At night time, certain players as part of their wind down is to try and socialize, and whether that involves them on electronic devices and whatever. What we try and do with our athletes in that space, though, is social media is, you know, for me is a lot of a self-gratification tool, right? So people put a thing on social media. What are they hoping to achieve? They're hoping to get likes or get responses. So then they want to engage in that process. So we will say to our players, look, by all means, you socialize with your network through social media as much as you want, but these would be the times when we would try and reduce your social media activity. Okay, if we're going back to that alertness versus conscious situation around sleep, there's some of the discussions that we would have. There was a really good thing with Texas Tech in March Madness a few years ago, where the captain come out and his idea was to ban cell phones at night, and then the manager would go around and get the bag and collect all the cell phones, and you know, those guys went on to 13-3 or whatever it was. So there's a lot of things around that, and there's a recent study in the Journal of Sleep Research on late night tweeting and NBA players and the impact on performance. So I think there's a whole lot in that particular space. But at the end of the day, we're caught between what is high, valid scientific research practice, what level of efficacy there is, but more importantly, I'm a fairly simplistic coach in that what is easy for my athletes to do, that, because ultimately what do we want? We want to have a change in behavior in some description. We want them to engage and drive this process. So provide them with tools to do that.
That was awesome, Stephen. I want to add one more thing to that conversation, because we've touched on so many aspects of recovery, which I think the audience will can take from so much. From my perspective, and I think a lot of our audiences can relate, is the budget issue. For example, we don't have a massage therapist. We are very small in staff. We don't have a cryo chamber. We actually have not much, to be honest, but we all have sleep and nutrition at our own power, right? And one slide I incredibly loved in your presentation was the pyramid with the 90%. And what I always try to explain to my athletes first and foremost is actually show this pyramid. And a lot of them are first kind of thinking and saying, well, we knew, but now you're actually re-emphasizing that. And 90% is a lot. So they start having conversations with me and like, are you sure it's 90%? And so we start having these conversations, but what is the biggest issue is that athletes come in, they have their Theragun on their calf. The first thing they want after practice is jump on the table and ask everyone for a massage, right? Or they're complaining about all small things, while sleep and nutrition is completely trashed. And so that's one of the, I think, main keys that we try to drive home is like, you don't have to be in the NBA to be a very well recovered athlete, or to the best you can. And And one of the ways that we try to emphasize that is through the recovery point system. We use it as well, but we've used a much higher weight on sleep and nutrition. So we would even tenfold the points on the sleep checklist and on the nutrition checklist. So if athletes actually doing a lot of the little things and one athlete is only nailing home 2 important things, he gets the advantage. And so they would start having conversations against each other, compete against each other. And well, you had that only one recovery aspect right, and you win. Why? Well, here we go, and we start having this conversation. So I think it's incredibly important to emphasize, and that's why we also named this webinar Sleep and Recovery, right? That is the 2 most important things, in my opinion, and according to the research. So, and it's incredible to see that still coaches and athletes not always live their talk. Let's put it like that. So
100%. And that's the thing is that once again, I'm very simplistic. My athletes are like my 13-year-old son. All right, they want to play games. I need to engage with them, so I need to show them some color and some numbers and put it in a context where they can see how is this beneficial to my on-court performance. If we don't do that, I think it's very challenging to have any type of buy-in, because ultimately, if you put this down to its simplest form, we're in the relationship business. We have to be able to develop relationships with coaches who I'm going to communicate with a certain way. I have to develop relationships with the players who I'm going to communicate with in probably a different way than I'm communicating with I have to communicate to front office. All right. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I guess the better you can look at the way you communicate and the way you deliver and handle yourself to develop those relationships. Because the other great quote that I love is, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care, right? And you talk about massage. We use massage. Our players love nothing more than to somebody to put their hands on them. All right. If they do that for 15 minutes post game or 20 minutes post game and they feel good, fantastic. I'm happy with that. Because for me, if they're saying that works for them and that makes them feel better, that makes them feel more recovered, that makes them feel mentally better, man, I don't care if it's, we do things, like our hydration protocols. Our number 1 hydration protocol, which is lapped up by the players, is chocolate paddle pops post game. What is it? It's just frozen liquid, right? So it's got all the stuff in there, the same as if I'm drinking a chocolate milk or if I have a particular branded protein supplement. It's all relative to the level of your resources. So there's no reason why recovery and sleep can't be priorities if you're looking at athlete health and wellness as your main focus. And I guess, for that part, Meeta, you would see a variety of individual athletes across the time. And I'd be really interested to see where you go with that.
Meeta, I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you. So I was going to, just to tag on what you were saying, a couple of things. Number 1 is that you have to repeatedly and consciously show the athlete that you have their best interest in mind. You have to show them, and you have to do this on a repeated basis to be able to develop a rapport. This because, so in the work that I do, I'm looking for clear, completely candid conversations with athletes, right? I really need to understand what they're saying so that I can help them. And so clear, candid conversations really help, and that can only occur if they completely trust you. And yes, it's good. And there was actually a question about it. Well, is 9 hours together at night a good thing, or can you take a mid-afternoon nap? Well, mathematically, many times your players don't have enough time for them to get 9 hours in bed. So it would be wrong to suggest something that doesn't actually fit into their daily lifestyle. So you have to begin from where they are and then work and, explain to them where you'd like them to be and work in small increments. And so that's the only way to make things work.
Yeah, I just want to echo it. Sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to say, we call that the Brussels sprout effect, right? Who likes eating Brussels sprouts? And what are you told when your parents say, you must eat your Brussels sprout? Right? Doesn't work. So we need to find ways, or in that case, what greens do my children like to eat that we can get. Same with my players and my athletes, right? Sorry, Sammy, go on.
No, we'll wrap up here soon. We're getting close to 2 hours, but I just want to echo what Thomas and Stephen, you guys are saying about essentially just majoring in the minors. And I think what a lot of what coaches think of recovery is like a foam roll in this corner and like a elastic band in this corner to stretch out your hamstrings. And it's like majoring in the minors and just not really getting a big bang for our buck. And it's so much deeper than that. And Stephen, I love what you're saying of everyone loves to just have passive recovery, get some hands on them. And if that makes them at ease and that brings them into a parasympathetic state, that's a win, because we got to give the players autonomy. And especially the NBA, it's a players run league, which is not a bad thing, but it's they have to have a seat at the table and they have to feel like they have some ownership of the program. So,
might I just make one point?
Of course.
It's really important to, I think, educate coaches, not just because they can dictate, they can decide what schedule they want their players to be around, but also remember, sleep is really essential for emotional regulation. And what are coaches supposed to do but to communicate? And so, all of us know coaches when they're short sleep, when they don't get enough sleep, and when they're getting mad at, and not being able to communicate what they want to say. So it really is important to discuss it with them. And it takes a while, because you have to kind of repeatedly give this information and ask them to relate it to to think back to when this could have made a difference. And then they are able to see how it can make a difference on court. The other thing is that I really liked what Stephen says, because I use that. So one of the things is that if you can get the buy-in of leader players, and they can convince and talk, and they can model good behavior, that also helps. That really, really does help, because the rookies are looking up to them to see how they should behave. And so it really is that midpoint you were talking about. It's so important, because they will call and they'll say, well, I think I have NBA sleep issues, which is all these rookies, because they're trying to adjust to the irregularity which is inherent in their schedule. And once they really have to learn how to get adjusted to it. And so, there are some screening tools that you can use, because firstly, there are some people. So there is something, it's called sleep reactivity. So there's this term, and actually it was at Henry Ford that we developed this. It's called this questionnaire, and it identifies people who don't have a sleep disorder, they don't have insomnia, they don't have any, but they're the people whose sleep will get disturbed whenever they're stressed. So if you can identify those group of people who are likely to, their sleep is going to deteriorate, then you know that those are the people, those are the players that need extra attention. And the second thing is that some people have something called the first night effect, which is they always sleep poorly when they're in a stranger environment. So they're more likely to sleep poorly when they go to a hotel. And, and so that's important to identify, because, you can strategically try to help them. So that is why, try to get good sleep when you can. And for many times, for players, it's when they're at home, because they're in their own home environment. And you know, for people who work in the NBA, so I'll tell you, a lot of players say they actually sleep better on the road because they have, you know, they have families, they have social obligations at home that interfere with their sleep, and they sometimes sleep better, you know, on the road. And so even taking a holistic approach and educating families to explain that, you know, this is a, you know, you have to be a little the player has to be a little selfish about their sleep, you know, and their recovery, even when they're at their own homes.
Great point. Yeah, I'm just gonna piggyback off what you're saying about like the influence of players,
Right.
older players, vets, and coaches. Like we had a personal story. We had a few coaches who started using a sensory deprivation tank, which I don't know the efficacy on that. I haven't looked at the research, but we'll just say it's a good recovery protocol. And then some players started using it. So I think like, especially when you have adults around and it's not NCAA, and even NCAA, you could have some influence there. But when the coaches step up and it starts to have this culture of people valuing it, I think it goes a long way.
Yeah, I'll jump in with that. At the, you know, away from the players, the coaches. You know, we often would say, "Coach, you're next on the table, right?" And look, when does the coach get a massage? When does the coach jump into a Sin-Step tank? You know, when is it? So we've been in some situations, as I said, in those organizations where the values, the goals, everything is, you know, the better teams that have that culture, you know, we've had situations where the coaches are involved in that process, you know, physically engaging in some of those things, you know, and one of the things the other day, I'm sure everyone's watching the, you know, The Last Dance, and saw Phil Jackson the other day on court with all the playing group doing mindfulness and yoga, and, you know, those sort of things. I think the value of those is a lot louder and more impactful than people generally realize, because the person in a lot of instances that is most close to some of the players on a relationship level, not on a coaching, on a relationship level, is quite often the coach.
Sure. Well, I know it's Mother's Day over there in Australia, Stephen, so I don't want to get you.
That's right. My wife's waiting upstairs for breakfast in bed.
But Meeta and Stephen, like, that was really, really high quality information. Really appreciate you guys sharing, and I know you guys are in high demand, so like that was great. That was really, really awesome.
Thank you for allowing us to contribute.
Of course.
Likewise.
Cool. So we're not going to field any questions right now from the audience because I think we answered a lot of them during the webinar. So if anyone has anything else to add out of you three guys, otherwise I just want to thank everyone again. Really, really great stuff. No problem. What I'll just throw in there. So if anyone wants, happy to share the material, you can go to my website. So SPB International. I'll have a link on there. We have an MVP room. So I'll have it set up in there where people can log in and download the slides and some papers of interest, for example. Alternatively, obviously active on social media. So you'll find my links in there wherever. Happy to answer any questions. Jump on the website, send me an email, SPB International.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. So I do have a website. It's maybe you can link it, Thomas.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's meetasinghmd.com, and I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, and so I'm always happy to answer questions. And I always know if you're texting me at 2 o'clock in the morning, that you do need help. Just FYI.
Well, great, guys, everyone. Continue to stay safe, and thanks again for everyone who joined us. And we will see everybody soon.
Thank you.
Amen to that, Sam. I appreciate you guys so much, and it was awesome. A lot of great content. So stay healthy out there. Enjoy Mother's Day, and we'll chat soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.